Hey everyone, this is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the show where I sit down and just talk with other writers. No real agenda. We just start hitting record and we just talk about writing, talk about life, talk about writing. We don't really, or we rarely, I should say, talk about my guests' books, although today that was a bit of an exception. But before we get to that, just a reminder that my new thriller, Tell Me What You Did, is out. It's doing really well, outpacing sales of any of my other books. The Barnes & Noble monthly pick for it really helped that out. So you can check it out. That big, beautiful, bright orange cover that you can see in my background here. Tell Me What You Did. It might give you nightmares. I've been emailed by more than one person telling me I've given them nightmares, and that is about the highest praise a thriller writer can get. All right, so today on the show I had Douglas Brunt. Douglas Brunt is the author. I'm holding up the book cover now. The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel. So nonfiction. I mostly read nonfiction, but I love, there's so much nonfiction that is it's captivating. It reads more fantastic than a novel even does. Like you wouldn't write these things as a novel because they wouldn't be believable. And I remember reading The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel and just being really transfixed with the story. Tremendous writing, and I reached out to Doug just to see if he wanted to be on the show, and he very graciously agreed. Turns out actually he has his own podcast as well with SiriusXM that he runs out of Manhattan. So who knows? Maybe I'll be on there one day. But he also just talks with other writers about all things writing. But Doug's got a really interesting background. Like me, was in business for years and years and years, and he had his own company, sold that, but he started writing kind of without any background or experience like me, and he had pretty quick success. His first book was a New York Times bestseller, and then he followed it up with two other novels. And then he totally pivoted to nonfiction, and he fell in love with it. And now he's got another 2-book deal after the runaway success with his Diesel book. But it was fascinating to talk to him, to hear about the process of changing from writing novels to writing nonfiction, the learning how to do it, learning how to footnote, learning how to research. Obviously these things are tremendously researched. And in fact, he said this book, start to finish, was about a 5-year endeavor. So probably a pretty steep learning curve. And that was particularly fascinating to me because I can't really wrap my head around all of a sudden writing a nonfiction book and all the work that it would take to get it accurate. And, the fear of running out of material because you're not in control of the material. So hopefully you can find, hopefully there's material to find, and hopefully it's compelling enough to support your vision for the book. But he was great to talk to. And at the end, we made up a fairly unhinged story, using a sentence from a Baldacci novel. So you're going to like this one, folks. This is my excellent conversation with Douglas Brunt. And as you get older, you're like, I'll give this book 50 pages.
Right.
What kind of reader are you? Do you punch out or you commit?
I've evolved in kind of in the way you're describing. I used to feel this commitment to finish what I started, and now I'm like, it's too short. Someone recently did a calculation for me. They're like, we're in our mid-50s, so say we've got 30 years left, and you read and average a book a month. So they did this. It's like you've got like 450 books left to read in your life, so you can't spend time on a bad one.
Yeah, totally. Well, so it sounds like we're about the same age, and it's interesting, just the roundabout way all this stuff happens is I read your Diesel book, and I'm a thriller writer, but I mostly read nonfiction. and I'm reading this book. I'm like, this is a fucking great book. And then sometimes you just think, well, let me just reach out to this person, seeing maybe they're interested in having a conversation. And then I start seeing you on social media, and then I'm like, oh, this guy's got a podcast with SiriusXM. Oh, there's my friend Wendy Walker on his podcast. So like these are weird worlds that are colliding. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what you do with Sirius and your podcast and kind of how that came about.
Great. Are we on? Are we going here?
We are rolling.
Awesome. Sometimes there's like, I don't know if you're like warming me up to make sure I'm, in my sweet spot here. But.
No, I love because I always do a pre-recorded intro and outro where I kind of go through all the housekeeping. So I love just rolling into it. And so it's organic and natural.
Great. I'm with you on that. So the reason for the podcast, that the sort of backstory of how that all came about is prior to writing, which is really a second career for me. My first career was in business, and I was running a security software company. Yeah. It's funny, a number of authors I've talked to,
totally,
including Wendy Walker, actually. It's like her third or fourth act, maybe even. But
yep.
I had investors and an executive team and customers and employees, all the stuff, and a very active, interactive day. And when I sold that company, I started writing, of course, as you know, although, having a podcast is an exception for us both. It's pretty solitary, and you go into your little writer's bunker, and suddenly there was this massive void of seeing people in my life. And while I was running that company, though, I was in this organization called YPO, which stands for Young Presidents Organization. And it had this element to it called Forum, which was a monthly gathering of 8 to 10 or so other young CEOs of companies. And you would be able, it was, the main thing of Forum was confidentiality. So you could share anything. You could talk about life, work, balance, and all the stuff that you might need help with, and a shoulder to lean on. And so it's like a form of therapy in a way, professional therapy. And so I tried to recreate that once I was out of the business world and into the writing world. And after, as you know, you're running around on tour, Wendy, you get to meet folks over time. As you're running around, and most events these days are in conversation. And so over a bit of time, I got to meet a number of other writers. And I said, what if we did this thing kind of like YPO Forum, and we can even give it a hook around books. And so we'll make it a book club, but we'll basically get together. We'll have a bunch of cocktails. We'll shoot the breeze for an hour. Then we'll talk about a book for an hour, and we'll try to do it on a regular basis. And I loved it. A bunch of other writers were in it. They loved it. It got a little bit nipped by COVID, because I also moved out of Manhattan after COVID as well. But it had a bunch of great writers in it, like Lee Child and Harlan Coben and Amor Tolles and on down the line. And so I was telling a friend of mine at SiriusXM about it, and I said, this could be kind of cool. He's like, let's do it. Like, that should be a show. And so this is a version of the show. The idea of the show is the conversations that would come in something like that. It's like 3 bar stools, me, the guest, and the audience at the third bar stool as we're just having a drink. So each show opens with me making the favorite cocktail of the guest, and fix it on set, and we have a drink and chat for a little while.
That's awesome. And it's funny, I sense we have slightly parallel lives, but I started this podcast right after COVID, or 2020, early 2021. And the impetus was, you do all these interviews, and a lot of them are pretty banal. And, you get questions like, which one of your characters do you want to have dinner with? And, but what I listen to is podcasts like Maron's WTF, where it's just like the journey, right? So I'm like, I love talking to writers, and I want to talk to writers, but I don't really want to talk to them about their specific books, because also I don't have time to read all those books. I want to find out, why did they become a writer? What, tell me about your rejections. Tell me about when the shit hit the fan, and then tell me about the good times. And it's totally like, I don't script anything. I'm just like, I just wing it, because it's like meeting you at a bar and be like, oh, that's really cool. You have an interesting life. I want to hear more about it. And it's just, I think for me, it's a lot more fun, even though if it gets a little inside baseball at time, but then you get, aspiring writers listening and getting advice and stuff like that. So how do you book guests? You just reach out to people, or?
I mean, in the beginning, it was friends who I said, hey, I'm doing this thing. Come on. They're like, sure, I'll have a Negroni. And so that was fun. And being in New York is helpful. I do all of them in person, and being in New York is helpful for that.
Yeah.
And then I was, having been in the industry for a bit, I've gotten to know publicists at a number of different publishers. So I'll reach out and say, hey, is so-and-so coming through? Would love to see him. And now I'm sure it's the same for you. Publicists reach out saying, hey, can so-and-so come on?
Right.
So now I catch people on tour. David Graham was just on because he's got the Wager out in paperback.
Yeah, I just read The Wager. Fucking great.
It's a great book, really. Such a good yarn, and he weaves it all together and of course, deeply researched and really, really good.
Totally. Yeah. And it's funny. And yeah, you do get those publicist requests, and that's probably the preponderance of my guess. And then you get to the point where I'm like, all right, I only record once a week because it is time consuming. So, you get booked out like 6-7 months, and then you have to start saying no, which is kind of uncomfortable for me. I'm not great at doing that. But after a while, you just have to do that.
Maybe not yet is the better answer. Not right now.
Well, I've tried that. And it's funny, and this sounds shitty if these publicists are listening, but you read certain bios and you're just like, this just doesn't feel like a fit. And then other ones that are kind of that not yet, of like, my schedule's packed, but maybe for the next book. So, because they will keep coming back, which they should. That's their job to keep reaching out. So I'm curious about, so I want to kind of go through your transformation. Because I was 33 when I started writing. And I've been in the business world for decades in hospitality, real estate. And I started writing out of boredom one day during a continuing education class, and that turned into this 400-page manuscript. I had no idea what I was doing, but I had no aspirations to write. I had no training in writing. So to me, this was like something to look at and be curious about. Why did this happen? Is this what I'm supposed to be doing with my life? So really kind of on one day I changed. I kept working, obviously, because you're a fool not to. But zero plans for that. And so I'm curious, now when you were a kid, did you have, or teen or whatever, did you have leanings towards, I definitely want to go into business, versus like, yeah, I feel like I've got stories to tell?
Leanings were toward business and a more traditional job, career path to earn some money. I didn't know any writers, so I didn't even think as a career. I did go to a prep school, and my favorite teachers were my English teachers, and I loved literature. I loved reading. I mean, it wasn't exactly the "Oh, Captain, my Captain" of Poet Society, but I was into it. I really loved.
So this is New England. You grew up, I'm assuming.
Just outside of Philadelphia.
Okay.
Radnor, Pennsylvania. So, but went to a private prep school there. That really the best teachers we had. Just my good fortune, we had an exceptional English department there. All the best teachers in the school were this collection of English teachers. In this one period of time, they were just amazing. And I think the school even now looks back at that as being the golden age of their English department. Although there's some great people there today too. But I was lucky to really love these teachers, and they taught me to love books, and they taught me how to write.
Yeah.
In those days, it wasn't really creative writing as so much as, essays and persuasive writing and that sort of thing. But writing is for the most part, and loved reading. And then so the love of reading always continued through into college. But then again, it wasn't like, there was no example in my life of someone doing it as a career.
It's just this vague, watery notion that it happens somewhere out there in the world.
Yeah,
somehow these books appear.
Of course, but they're probably on another continent or something. And so I did take a more traditional, business path in my career. But similar to you, hit some periods in there where I was bored and always loved the reading. Never took a creative writing class. I didn't do an MBA or anything like that. And not to knock those at all. I think they could be great. I know a number of people who swear by their experience there. And then I know a number of people who did it and say, that wasn't really useful either for me. Kind of everyone's different, obviously. And but hit a point in my career where I was dissatisfied with the job. I was traveling a lot. It really was a grind. The company was doing pretty well, but it was really, people say, oh, you're an entrepreneur. That must be so wonderful. You make your own hours. I'm like, yes, I get to choose which 18 hours of the day I'm going to work.
Right. Which hours I'm not going to work. The 3 hours I'm not going to work each day.
Yeah. And I was on vacation with my wife, and I read The Gold Coast by Nelson DeMille.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you ever read that one. And
Yeah,
Nelson's
yeah, of course. It's a beast.
it's so great, and I loved it. And I got to the end of it, and I thought, I want to make people feel the way this book made me feel.
Hmm.
That,
Mm-hmm.
and I've kind of, it was the first time it resonated as strongly in that way. Of course, you read a great book even in high school, you're like, wow, that's so great. I wish I could do that. But somehow with the Gold Coast and DeMille, it was more of a rubber hits the road. And I started writing after that, even though I was full time on this other thing. I just started writing this idea I had for a novel, even on the plane ride home from the vacation. But even then, the idea was a hobby. Like, I just think this is so fun. I want to try it,
Right.
And I didn't have any expectation of selling it or anyone beyond my wife, and maybe not even her, ever reading it.
Right.
And but then it came together. I thought, this actually feels pretty good. And so I took the chance of showing it to her, which could have been a humiliation if she read it. It was like, oh my God, my husband's an idiot.
Right.
How embarrassing. But she liked it, and so I stayed on it, and then pursued finding an agent, which I got it in front of an agent through a friend, and the agent, basically had the feedback of, there's something here. You've got the right voice for the characters. It works with a little bit of development between us. I think it's something we could take out and sell. And so,
yeah. Wow. I mean, that's great, because as we all know, and I think my agent told me recently that it's gotten so much harder than it has ever been to find an agent, that having a potential agent who sees kind of the diamond in the rough and takes you on, I don't know if that happens much these days. It's like, it's got to be perfect, because I've got a slush pile that's as tall as my house, so I don't have time to work with you on this. So that's amazing, because similar to you, I got an agent after 75 rejections with my first novel, that my first 3 didn't sell. So, it's agents are taking massive risks, and even when they do sell, that doesn't mean they're going to make more than, a few $1,000s, who knows? And they're making 15% of that. So it's a real commitment on their part. So did that novel sell?
it sold pretty well. It did, but back
But the
then,
fact that it sold to a publisher at all is amazing.
yeah. So I got in with Touchstone, which is was an imprint at Simon & Schuster. They closed that one down, and the book sold well. It was set on Wall Street, and it actually got a bit of buzz within Wall Street, and some pickup on some of the sort of financial news networks and things like that. So I don't think the Times does this anymore, but it had the extended bestseller list. So it was like 15, and then they would, for whatever reason, do like 5 on the extended list, and I made that.
Oh.
Sold enough to allow
That
me
counts.
to call myself a Times bestseller. So,
Yeah, that's amazing. Were you with your first novel? That's crazy. That's a rare story.
Yeah, had a little insider buzz in the Manhattan Wall Street segment.
And then you're thinking, and the reality of it is even a Times bestseller, which is fantastic, which is multiple thousands of copies sold in a week. When you look at the reality of the ultimate, royalty paycheck with that, it's not like you're like, I'm retiring and doing this now forever.
No,
it's
paying the rent on that alone.
Right.
Sure.
You look at your corporate job or your day job or your entrepreneurial business, and you're like, okay, so now I'm making a 10th. I can't live off of this. This is cool. And sometimes it's still hard to even not see it as a hobby, even though you're a Times bestseller, because of that. But I assume early on, you were starting to think like, I could see this being my future. It's just a question of when. Was that a fair statement?
Yes, I remember joking with my wife. She's like, "You're a writer now." I'm like, "I don't think I can call myself a writer until I do it one more time." Like, the old thing. Like,
right, this was a fluke.
Like, maybe that was it. Like, maybe I wrote, but I'm not a writer. There has to be like an element of repetition to say I'm a writer. That sort of implies repeatability.
Right.
And so then in the end, I've written 3 novels, and then Rudolf Diesel, the Diesel story here, is the first nonfiction book. And I'm kind of on the nonfiction track. But yeah, now I would say I'm a writer as a career. And that is the main career. The podcast I do is more of the moonlighting side of the career.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the Diesel book by far outsold everything else combined. And so I'm actually like sustaining myself now on the books.
It's such a wild journey. And so I only write novels, but my 10th just came out, and in a month it's outselling any one of my other books by far. So it's pretty much a breakout, at least for me. Mm-hmm. And you just don't know. You just have no idea of why did that story resonate? Why did this story resonate? But I do want to shift to talking about that change, because from my perspective, especially with the kinship of not having ever taken a class and not having ever studied this, and just still figuring it out. Like I mentioned, I mostly read nonfiction, and I'm just in awe whenever I'm reading nonfiction. I'm just the author, found a compelling subject that hasn't been either written about or certainly not overwritten about, and they turned it into essentially a novel in terms of how it reads, how it compels. But the fucking research on this, I have a great friend, and I don't know if she's been on your podcast, but Abbott Kaler, who lives in New York, who writes both nonfiction and fiction, and I read her stuff, and I'm like, how do you how do you do this? How do you approach a subject? And I feel like I would read a newspaper article about Rudolf Diesel, and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting, but I wouldn't even know where to begin. So where did this particular, and we're talking about the mysterious case of Rudolf Diesel, where did that particular nugget come from?
It was laborious. I mean, I've always done a lot of research for my novels, but all primary research, really. Right. A lot of interviews. One was on Wall Street, one was in politics, media, one was sports, and I interviewed lots of people for that. So I actually love the research side of it. The Diesel story started because I bought this boat, and it was an older boat and needed to be fixed up. There's a short bit about this in the sort of intro to the book, I guess, like a note from the author or whatever. And in short, I repowered the boat to diesel engines because this guy at the boatyard was saying, it's a totally different thing. 100% of boat fires come from gasoline engines, none from diesel. The fuel efficiency is 4 times as great. It's got less fumes. The maintenance is amazing. If you take care of these engines, your grandkids will be running this boat on the same engines and all this. So I repowered to diesel. And then I started to get a little pride of ownership in diesel. Like, wow, diesel is a different thing. And I started to appreciate that I had this, quote unquote, secret knowledge about engine tech. And then I was kicking around ideas for a new novel, and I came across this list online, and I was just sort of goofing around, following threads online of mysterious disappearances at sea. And on the list was Rudolf Diesel. And I was just, getting up to speed on the diesel engine. I thought, I wonder if this is in connection with my engines. And of course it is. Rudolf Diesel invented a diesel engine in 1897, but he disappeared in 1913 right before the war. And there was speculation that it went down as suicide, but there was speculation that he might have been murdered by either John Rockefeller, the founder of Standard Oil, or Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany. So that set me on the spot. I'm like, wow, this is very cool.
It's a big story.
Right. And I was thinking, well, maybe I'll write historical fiction, which I'd also never done. I've got and as you say, there's very little written about him. In the English language, there's almost nothing. The Encyclopedia Britannica entry on him at that time, it's gotten bigger since the book came out, but at that time it was very short. And I thought, well, maybe, I've got the scaffolding of a story here. I'll just make up dialogue and I'll sort of follow the thread and, do historical fiction. And then I even sort of wrote a couple treatments like that. And then I started to uncover more information and got in touch with some archives and found old newspaper stuff. And then through the archives got his diaries and letters. And then I started following different threads of people connected to the story and started to put the whole thing together. So in the end, it was over 5 years of work.
Yeah. Oh, I believe it.
And a ton of research. But about 9-12 months into it, I realized I've got to do this as nonfiction. I can't do it as book fiction. It really needs to be done as nonfiction. So
yeah, and you have to kind of teach yourself how to do that. I mean, something as simple, which I'm sure isn't simple, but how to footnote properly. All that kind of stuff that you're thinking about. God, I haven't footnoted anything since junior year in high school. Yeah. So it's amazing, but I think what kind of is so the gravitational pull for me of the book, of course you're lured in by the idea that you didn't know. First of all, nobody knows Diesel, right? And then the fact that he disappeared. So it's compelling, right? The title is compelling, the cover is compelling, but you're reading this, and all of a sudden, you're thinking, how have I never heard of any of this? How did I not know anything about the diesel engine? How do I look at gas stations all the time that have the word diesel and never think about what the difference in that type of fuel is? And you do start getting into it, and you're like, this guy was totally murdered. It's the same story, the threat of a big corporation to its source income from something that's more efficient and cheaper. Of course, we see this all the time. And so that to me was the most compelling part, was like this. I mean, this guy was a rock star. He was the belle of the ball at everywhere he went. Everybody knew Diesel's name, and you read it and you're like, I didn't know Diesel was supposed to be capitalized. That kind of a basic thing. So you must have been just more and more pulled into it the more you unearthed.
I was, and there are so many things, as you suggest, there are so many things happening then that echo today. And sometimes it's not even an echo, it's like the exact same thing. There are elements of the human condition, technology being repurposed by people who want to pervert it for other things, or they're threatened by the technology, so they influence outcomes. Tech being used for war. Elon Musk is launching rockets and satellites that actually play a purpose in war. The diesel engine is the only way to operate a submarine. So the diesel engine, although Rudolf Diesel intended it for these other things, gets used for submarines and U-boats, which of course play all this havoc in both world wars. And there are even elements in the story, like, speaking of little footnotes, one of the things I do when I have a piece of information that I love so much that I can't get rid of it, but it doesn't really propel the story forward, I'll drop it into here's a fun little footnote for you at the bottom of the page. Right. And one of those is that in 1905, New York City had a fleet of taxi cabs, and they were all electric. And there was a battery charging station on Broadway in Times Square. So we keep thinking of these electric cars as this new thing, like a newfangled Elon Musk thing, but this was all going on more than 100 years ago, 120 years ago.
That's amazing. Those batteries must have been huge.
Yeah, well, the batteries, that was the problem. It didn't really work, but the batteries leaked, and they did have some problems. But at the time, it almost was working out, because then there weren't really suburban or country roads, so they didn't have to go far from the charging station. Like, these taxis were just going around little spots in New York, and they never were far from their charging station on Broadway, and they'd just come back and charge up again, and out they'd go, and not have to drive, a couple hundred miles to DC or something. Like, that wasn't a thing. So it almost kind of worked for a period of time. But it's like, and that's just one example of one of the things that was happening 120 years ago, where it just comes back around. We're kind of dealing with the same things. Like, Faulkner has this wonderful line, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And I kept thinking that as I was doing this book. It's like, oh my God, this is the exact same thing we're dealing with. Sometimes it was like a reflection of it in slightly different circumstances, and sometimes it just felt like the exact same thing that we're doing all over again. It was really wild.
And it's ultimately a cold case book, right? Because it's never resolved, and you just like, we don't know what happened, and that's kind of not so much the point of the story. It does, and I got a sense after reading it that this book is kind of like a tribute that he probably never received elsewhere, posthumously, in terms of recognition for his achievements. Did you hear from any descendants or anything like that? Any comments on either thank you for doing this, or you got this all wrong?
I talked to two descendants prior to publication, which is great, although they knew the sort of general premise of the book. One was a woman descended from Rudolph's daughter, and she actually lived in the Northeast here in the U.S. as an au pair one summer many years ago. She didn't have too much information about the history of the family or Rudolf Diesel. But I also talked to a gentleman descended from Rudolph's uncle. His last name was Diesel. He's a physician in France, sort of on the border of France and Germany. And he'd actually done a fair amount of work to explore the family history, and I met him in time to get some help from him. He pointed me to a few archives, one in Denmark that has some great old photos of this ship built by a Danish firm that Kaiser Wilhelm sailed, diesel-powered cargo ship that was, these new diesel cargo ships were changing merchant fleets around the world at that time. To the present day, every cargo ship you see, you go down the Hudson River in New York, any cargo ship you see out there, they're all diesel-powered still to this day, 120 years later.
Right, because it's more efficient.
More efficient, yeah. It has that torque. It can deliver the power, but efficiently. So those were the two that I met. The thing though that's come back since Pub is there are a number of people in the intelligence community. So while the diesel thing officially went down as a suicide, that he was traveling. So for people know, I won't give away the end, but he's in September 1913, he's traveling across the North Sea on a passenger ferry from Belgium to Great Britain. He's going to go attend the founding ceremony of a new diesel engine manufacturing company, of which he's on the board and an owner, whose mandate is to build diesel engines for the Royal Navy submarine program. So he's helping the Royal Navy at a time when the Anglo-German naval arms race is really at a fevered pitch, and so that's why they thought Kaiser Wilhelm. So Diesel, he disappears on that trip, and the murder suspects are there. I offer a conclusion of what happened to Diesel, and without sort of spilling the beans on the conclusion, because it's fun the way the investigation unfolds at the end of the book. A number of folks from the intelligence community have come back and said 100%. They don't have the documents, they don't have the proof, but they're like, our read of this, of the facts you lay out, and there's a preponderance of evidence, I would say. It's a circumstantial case, right, with a preponderance of evidence, and they're like 100% the conclusion.
Oh, that's interesting.
What we believe happened as well.
So I'm curious about, from the writer side of all of this, you start writing novels, and I think, the conventional wisdom, which is true, is that you start to get known for a certain type of book, and that becomes your brand. And then depending on your publisher, it's hard to wiggle too far away from that, unless maybe you write under a different name as well. And you said you had kind of started with this idea being historical fiction, which would already be a bit of a departure, but still a novel. At what point are you telling your publisher, or are you telling your publisher? I don't know if you've sold it on spec. Usually with nonfiction, you would sell it on a proposal. Hey, this is going to be totally because your editor typically is like, well, I don't do nonfiction. That would be somebody else. So you would have to talk to them, and no guarantee of selling it. So what was that whole process like?
Professionally, from both the agent and publisher standpoint, it was a reboot for me. But I've always wanted to do it that way. One of the careers I've admired the most is Michael Crichton, who did so many different things. All of his books were very different. From Jurassic Park to Rising Sun to The Great Train Robbery to starting the show ER. And he did so many different things. I love the eclectic nature of what he pursued.
Most of it all science kind of threaded somehow, but across the board.
Yeah. And except like Great Train Robbery. I mean, he even he was out there on a number of things. After my first book did pretty well, my agent was saying, let's see what happens next in this character's life. Like, let's do this version too, and kind of keep going with those characters. And I didn't want to do that. So I did a totally different book, and then a totally different book for the third. And then when I pivoted into the idea for nonfiction here, I actually even went to get a different agent, and one much more focused on nonfiction kinds of books, because it was sold on a proposal, and I had no idea how to even write a proposal.
Right.
And so I found a different agent, and it was easier to get an agent this way because I had a track record of selling books, and found an agent that I like, and we did kind of walk through the proposal process together. Yeah. And then went out to brand new set of publishers. So it's so I was with a new editor at a new house.
Yeah, you would almost have to be. But then you're telling your agent also, with the proposal, you sell a proposal, and then I don't know when in the process that happened, but in the 5 years that it took to make the book, once you have a proposal, I assume accept a proposal, you have a deadline. So is that pretty deep into the book writing, or that was at the start of the 5-year process?
That the finished proposal was well fleshed out, and that was probably 2 years in, I would say.
Okay, got it.
Maybe not quite 2 years, but pretty far in, because I'd already done drafts of the narrative or the historical fiction, and had a pretty good outline of what I wanted to do.
Right.
By the time it was all, because it was a very detailed proposal that I put forward.
Yeah.
I mean, now when I'm doing, so after that came out, I re-signed for a 2-book deal, and now it's more than just a meeting and a conversation of what I'll do next, but it doesn't need to be what that initial proposal was. And
right. They've seen what you're capable of doing. And I'm just from the fiction writer's mindset. Sometimes you get the questions like, isn't that hard? You have to figure everything out. I'm like, that's what makes it easy. I can just make anything up. I'm not handcuffed to anything. That doesn't mean it's going to be right or good or interesting, but I have complete freedom in doing that. And, when I read nonfiction and then the author's notes that anything that appears between 2 quotation marks is absolutely recorded as being accurate. And I'm like, oh my God, the work. And then I'm also curious about, are there times where you're like, oh, I really want him to be able to say this because that's so much more interesting than what he actually said? Do you find that you're straining against the leash sometimes, against your creative impulses to change the story?
No, because what I find is always more interesting that I could make up.
All right.
I think when I was writing fiction, the hardest thing for me was plot. I'm pretty good at writing dialogue. I thought I was fine with that. I'm a good writer, like line by line writer, but I did struggle with plot more than anything else. I thought that was the hardest part for me.
Yeah. And
here it's done. I just need to uncover it. But then it's like picking up money off the street. It's amazing. Like the plot's done. I just follow, so you got to find it. And then you find stuff that's so mind blowing.
Yeah.
I find some little nugget in a letter in the archive or from some memoir. I'm like, oh my God, that happened. That connects to this and that and that. And then it all comes together in a way where it's the most exciting part of the whole thing. I love being in the archives. I love finding some piece that pulls it together for me in a way that I maybe didn't even expect or hope to find, but is so good. And so that's anyway, for me. So I almost have the inverse. Like plot was so hard for me, and making it up was, of course you can just make it up and that sounds easy, but it's so much harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
And having the plot there and just having to uncover it, which, not easy either. Research is laborious, but I enjoy it. So that part.
Yeah. Well, that's the huge thing. And I think that's where you and I differ a little bit. I'm not a big fan of research because it feels like homework to me, but I don't write books that typically require ton. You do what you have to do, obviously. But it feels like there's also kind of this lack of safety net writing nonfiction, in the sense of, I've got the story, I'm 2 years into it, I'm finding all this great stuff, and then all of a sudden there's this massive gap of years where there's just nothing I can find about what happens next. But you might not know that until you're 2 years deep into the project. I mean, this is just occurring to me. I have no idea if this is true or not, but that feels like that could happen.
That is a constraint that is a little scary. And before I've gone 2 years in, I've kind of, there's a bit of a litmus test that you do as much of it up front as you can to make sure there's available material out there to tell the story. There's going to be enough I can find. And you don't know everything you're going to find. You'll find things that make the story pivot this way and that, but there needs to be an available body of material out there sufficient to tell the story.
Right. Yeah. And so now in your mind, obviously with the success of the book and with the multi-book contract that follows, which I'm assuming is for works of nonfiction, in your and given your obvious joy in writing nonfiction, is that kind of it for you? You're like, this is my path now. I just want to do this. Or are you open to anything?
Certainly I'll see out this 2-book deal, and probably more. I think this is well suited to what I'm good at doing. And so I think there's probably the path. I do love writing the novel too, and it's not like I would rule out ever trying a
Right.
novel again,
Right.
or some other thing, or I've never written a screen. I have had no desire ever to try a screenplay, so I doubt I
Yeah.
go for that. But I could return to a novel if I got some fun idea. I could hobby around with that a little bit.
Well, right, and you can be if these go to potential series or something like that, you could be a writer's consultant on it, and where you would effectively be screenwriting, about Rudolf Diesel. I mean, I think that would be a lot of fun.
Well, it'd be fun to be. I know nothing about writing for film and
Me
TV,
neither.
so I don't know if I'd be useful. I'd be there for a resource on Diesel and the story and information that might be helpful to them. But and it'd be fun to sort of, if it ever does get made, it'd be fun to sort of wander around the set and see all that. But
100%. Yeah. Those it's funny, like that's such a fickle thing. I've had something under option for years and years and years, and you're just told like don't even think about it because chances are nothing will ever happen with it. And then you get these little nuggets of promise, and then you're like, all right, don't get excited. And then then nothing happens. And and you start to realize that Hollywood speak is way more optimistic and shielded than than the reality that looms behind it. So it gets So I just don't even
so
think
true.
about that much.
I occasionally get a very optimistic sounding email, and then I've kind of gotten as you were saying, I'm now in the place like, okay, rooting for you, but
Yeah.
I'm not gonna get all wound up about this.
Yeah, it's just a fickle industry. Well, Doug, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do our own quick storytelling. So I'm going to pull you back into the world of making things up. Um, and I have 3 books here that I've very much randomly chosen off my bookshelf. You're going to choose one of those books. We're going to choose a random sentence from a random page. And I'm going to read that sentence, and that'll be the first sentence in maybe a 2-minute long short story. So I'll read the sentence. You give me the next 1 or 2 sentences, whatever comes to your mind that might happen. I do a couple sentences, and when it goes completely off the rails, I'll shoot it in the head. These are fairly random, but they are all novels. I've got John Case's The Genesis Code, David Baldacci's Simple Genius, and Jacqueline Winspear's The Comfort of Ghosts. So choose one of those.
Let's go with Baldacci.
Yeah. All right. Give me a page between 1 and, geez, books used to be long.
You're like one of those magicians where it's like everything's random, and then all of a sudden you realize, wait, he's way ahead of me. How did he know all this?
Give me a number between 1 and 500.
499.
All right. So on page 499, I'm going to quickly scan it. All right. So I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this, and you can do whatever you want with it.
Oh boy.
He wanted to kill her, squeeze every molecule of arrogance, of superiority out of her ugly, filthy being.
And then he thought better of it. He realized there was something strangely attractive about her, and he thought, maybe I shouldn't kill her. I should instead
take her into the other room and ask her about my brother. After all, he's the reason I wanted to kill her. But I need to understand exactly what happened to him first, and only she will have the answers.
When we get to the other room, she surprised me by pulling a gun and telling me, I am going to do the exact same thing to you that I did to your brother, that rat.
Little did she know the sight of the gun and the fear of imminent death was a little bit of a turn on. I didn't quite know how to react, but rather than skulking away or hiding inside myself. I took 3 steps toward her until the barrel of the revolver snugged deep against my ribs.
She seemed to be feeling the same vibe, and she tossed the gun onto the bed and said, "What do you say we..."
I think we leave it there.
We nailed it. I mean, that's
well, except for the fact that I inadvertently shifted from third person to first person with my first sentence. It's funny. Almost every time we do this, it turns violent, but it's rare that we ever start with a clearly violent adjacent sentence. But this one just lended itself to. I felt like we actually went lighter than what it could have been given that first sentence.
That's true. Well, anyway, I think Baldacci would be proud.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, absolutely.
I think he's allowed to use any and all of that.
Yes. I hope so, and give us royalties for it. Doug, what a pleasure to talk to you. You know, I finished the book and I just loved it. So it was nice to be able to meet the author and to hear just what a varied background that you've had. And congratulations on all the success. And you're now one of those nonfiction names, like I would definitely Graham and Eric Larson were like, I don't care what the subject matter is. If the book is out, I'm buying it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what's coming out next.
Well, thanks very much, and congrats on your 10th novel.
Thanks, man. Hope to talk to you again soon and meet in person someday.
Definitely come through New York and come on my show.
Oh, I'd love to. All right. Thanks, buddy. Bye. So that's it. That is my conversation with Douglas Brunt. That was a good one. It was pretty captivating to listen to, and I just really appreciated hearing his journey, and particularly that pivot from fiction to nonfiction. I encourage you to learn everything you want to know about him by going to his website, which is douglasbrunt-author.com. And go ahead and check out my website, carterwilson.com. There you can buy my new book, Tell Me What You Did, subscribe to my newsletter, check out my events, read my blog, all that good stuff. And if you're an aspiring writer and you are looking for guidance or you're having struggles, check out my website, unboundwriter.com. There I offer self-guided online classes, one-on-one private coaching, as well as seminars and writing retreats. All right, friends, that is it for now. That is it for this episode of Making It Up. Another episode dropping just next week. In the meantime, take care.